The rain came down in sheets of gray, a merciless deluge that turned the world to mud and misery. It was the kind of rain that washed away roads, drowned crops, and hammered hope into the hard, unforgiving earth. For Silas, it was just another Tuesday. He rode with his head bent, the brim of his worn hat channeling a steady stream of water down his back. His horse, a stoic beast named Atlas, plodded onward, its hooves making sucking sounds in the mire. He was returning from a failed attempt to sell his last 2 calves in Redemption, a town that lived up to its name for no one he knew. The price offered was an insult, a pittance that wouldn't even cover the cost of the feed he'd need to get through the winter. So he was coming home empty-handed, the familiar bitterness a cold stone in his gut. It was a bitterness he had lived with for 5 years, ever since the world had ended. It had ended not with a bang, but with a shallow, gasping breath in a quiet cabin, taking his wife, Mary, and their newborn son with it. Since then, his life had been a hollowed-out thing, a routine of survival devoid of joy or purpose. He was miles from his ranch, the gray expanse of the plains broken only by the skeletal remains of a lightning-struck cottonwood, when he saw it. A splash of color against the unrelenting brown and gray. A small, hunched shape by the side of the trail. Mere a crude wooden signpost that pointed to nowhere anyone went anymore. At first, he thought it was a coyote, sick and dying. But as he drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It was a child. A little girl, no older than 6 or 7, huddled in a threadbare dress that had once been blue but was now stained the color of the earth. Her hair, a tangle of wet straw, was plastered to her skull. She wasn't moving. She was just sitting there in the middle of the deluge, as if waiting for the world to swallow her whole. Silas pulled Atlas to a halt. Every instinct, honed by years of solitude and grief, screamed at him to ride on. It wasn't his business. He had enough trouble, enough ghosts. Bringing another soul into his barren life was like inviting a flame. Into a powder keg. He had nothing to offer. Not food, not comfort, not hope. He was a ghost himself, haunting the shell of a life he'd once planned to build with Mary. But he didn't ride on. He couldn't. He swung his leg over the saddle, his boots sinking into the cold mud. The rain hit him with renewed force, soaking through his coat, chilling him to the bone. He approached her slowly, like one would a frightened animal. She didn't look up. Her small body was trembling violently, a continuous racking shudder that seemed to come from the very core of her being. In her lap, clutched with white-knuckled hands, was a small leather-bound Bible, its cover warped and swollen by the rain. It was the only thing she had. "Hey," Silas said, his voice a rough, unused thing. It sounded like stones grinding together. The girl flinched, curling in on herself, making herself smaller. A soft whimpering sound escaped her lips, a sound that was almost lost in the drumming of the rain. It was the sound of pure, undiluted terror. "You can't stay out here," he said, louder this time, trying to force a gentleness into his tone that he no longer possessed. "You'll die." She finally looked up, and the sight of her face was a physical blow. It was gaunt, her cheekbones sharp beneath pale, translucent skin. Her lips were blue with cold, but it was her eyes that stopped his heart. They were wide and vacant, a washed-out shade of gray that mirrored the sky, and they were utterly, completely empty. It was an emptiness he knew well. He saw it in his own reflection every morning. He crouched down, the cold of the mud seeping through his trousers. He was close enough now to see the dark circles under her eyes, the faint scratches on her cheeks. She smelled of wet wool and fear. "Where are your folks?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. No one left a child like this if they were coming back. She didn't answer. She just stared at him, her chest hitching with silent sobs. She wasn't crying anymore. It was as if she had run out of tears, and all that was left was the raw, mechanical motion of grief. Silas looked around, scanning the desolate landscape. Nothing. No wagon. No tracks that hadn't already been obliterated by the storm. Just the endless weeping sky and the two of them, two specks of misery in a vast, indifferent world. He was a fool. A damned fool. He should get back on his horse and leave this child to her fate. It was the way of the world. The world was cruel, and he was in no position to fight it. He stood up, ready to turn away, to retreat back into the cold comfort of his own sorrow. But as he looked down at her one last time, at the tiny, shivering form clutching a book of faith in a faithless world, he saw another image superimposed over her. He saw Mary, her face pale with effort, her hand clutching his. He heard the faint, weak cry of his son, a life that had flickered for only a few precious moments before being extinguished. He had failed them. He had been too slow, the doctor. Too far, his prayers too weak. He had let his family die. He couldn't do it again. He couldn't save the dead, but maybe, just maybe, he could save this one small living soul. It was a foolish, reckless thought, an act of madness. But it was the first thing he had felt in 5 years that wasn't grief or bitterness. It was a flicker of something else. Something terrifying and fragile and dangerously close to hope. He let out a long, shuddering breath, the rain mingling with the sudden hot tears that stung his eyes. He reached down, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he scooped her into his arms. She was lighter than a sack of flour, a bundle of cold, wet rags and brittle bones. She stiffened at his touch, a small, terrified gasp escaping her, but she was too weak to struggle. He held her tight against his chest, trying to shield her from the wind, and turned back toward his horse. The Bible fell from her lap into the mud. Silas hesitated for a second, then bent down and picked it up, tucking the sodden book inside his coat. He mounted Atlas with a grunt, settling the girl in front of him, her small head lolling against his chest. He wrapped the edges of his coat around her, a futile gesture against the relentless cold. Her shivering began to subside, replaced by a dead, unnerving stillness. He spurred Atlas onward, away from the crossroads, away from the ghosts of what might have been, and toward the uncertain future he had just irrevocably chosen. His life, the quiet, orderly tomb he had built for himself, was never going to be the same again. He didn't know if he was riding toward salvation or a different kind of damnation. He only knew that for the first time in 5 years, he was not riding alone. The journey back to the ranch was a slow, agonizing crawl through a world dissolving into water. The girl, Elora, he had found her name inscribed on the first page of the Bible in a delicate, looping script. Elora Miller was a silent, cold weight in his arms. She had drifted into a state of semi-consciousness, her breathing shallow and ragged. Silas's cabin, when they finally reached it, looked less like a home and more like a gravestone. It was a small, grim structure of hewn logs, chinked with mud and stubbornness, hunkered down against the wind. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, a lonely gray banner against the lonely gray sky. Inside, the cabin was stark and obsessively clean. A single room held a cot, a rough-hewn table with one chair, a stone fireplace, and shelves holding a few tins of food and a handful of books. There were no curtains on the windows, no rug on the floor, no pictures on the walls. It was the space of a man who was waiting to die, not living. The only warmth came from the fire he had banked before leaving, now a bed of glowing embers. He laid Elora gently on his cot, the only soft place in the entire cabin. Her wet dress clung to her like a second skin, and her small feet were bare and blue. He worked with a clumsy urgency, his hands, accustomed to the rough work of the ranch, fumbling with the tiny buttons of her dress. He stripped off the sodden garment and wrapped her in his driest wool blanket, tucking it tightly around her frail body. He stoked the fire, adding logs until it roared to life, casting flickering shadows that danced like specters on the walls. For the next 3 days, the storm outside was matched by the storm within the cabin. Alara was consumed by a raging fever. She tossed and turned on the cot, her skin burning to the touch, her lips cracked and dry. She cried out in her delirium. Not for him, but for a woman she called Mama. The word was a knife in Silas's heart, twisting with every utterance. He sat by her side, a helpless giant next to a fragile sparrow. He bathed her forehead with cool water, forced sips of broth between her lips, and listened to her fragmented, fever-induced ramblings. He learned her story in broken pieces. He heard of a long journey in a wagon, of dust and heat, and a song her mother used to sing. He heard of a sickness, a coughing fever that had stolen her father's breath, then her mother's. He pieced together the final horrifying act, the other wagons, the fearful faces, the hurried whispers. They had left her. The survivors, terrified of the sickness and burdened by their own desperate flight, had abandoned a 7-year-old girl at a crossroads with a dwindling supply of food and a prayer. During those long dark nights, with the wind howling outside, and the girl crying for her mother inside, the walls of Silas's carefully constructed fortress began to crumble. He found himself talking to her, his voice low and rough, filling the silence with words he hadn't spoken in years. He didn't talk about the ranch or the rain. He talked about Mary. He told the unconscious child about his wife's laughter, how it sounded like wind chimes. He described the way she would arrange wildflowers in a jar, how she believed even the most stubborn soil could be coaxed into bloom. He spoke of their dreams, of a house with more rooms, of a yard filled with the sound of children's laughter. He confessed his guilt, his profound, soul-crushing failure. He whispered his secrets to a dying girl, and in doing so, he felt a strange, painful loosening in his own chest, as if the poison of his grief was finally beginning to drain away. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. The rain had stopped, and a weak, watery sunlight filtered through the grimy window pane. Silas awoke slumped in the chair, his neck stiff, to find Alara awake. She was watching him, her gray eyes clear and lucid for the first time. The emptiness was still there, but it was different now. It was no longer a void. It was a vast, quiet lake of sorrow. He straightened up, his joints protesting. "You're awake," he said, his voice hoarse. She didn't reply. She just watched him, her gaze unwavering. He got up and ladled some of the broth he'd kept simmering over the fire into a bowl. He brought it to her, holding it out. "You need to eat." She stared at the bowl, then back at him. Slowly, tentatively, she reached out a small, trembling hand and took it. She sipped the broth, her eyes never leaving his face. They were locked in a silent, fragile truce. He was the man who had pulled her from the rain. She was the girl who had pulled him from his tomb. The days that followed were a delicate, clumsy dance of survival and trust. Alara remained silent, a small ghost haunting the corners of his cabin. She moved with a preternatural quietness, flinching at loud noises or sudden movements. Her world had shrunk to the 4 walls of the cabin and the small, worn Bible, which she kept by her side at all times. She would sit for hours, tracing the words with her finger, her lips moving silently, a private ritual of remembrance. Silas, in turn, struggled with the unfamiliar role of caregiver. He was a man of solitude, his habits ingrained and rigid. The presence of the child was a constant disruption. He found himself tripping over the small shoes she left by the hearth, instinctively lowering his voice when he entered the cabin, saving the best part of the stew for her. It was maddening. It was terrifying. It was, he slowly realized, a kind of resurrection. He tried to teach her things, practical things. He showed her how to collect eggs from the 3 scrawny chickens he kept, his large hands gently guiding her small ones. She recoiled at first, but when he placed a warm, smooth egg in her palm, A flicker of wonder crossed her face. He taught her how to knead dough, his clumsy attempts resulting in a cloud of flour that made her sneeze, a small, surprising sound that was almost like laughter. She, in her own silent way, began to change the space around them. One morning, he came in from chopping wood to find a small, defiant cluster of purple wildflowers sitting in a tin cup on the table. It was a replica of the memory he had shared with her during her fever, a memory of Mary. He stopped dead in the doorway, his heart seizing in his chest. It was a simple gesture, but it was an act of listening, of remembering, of connection. It was the first sign of bloom in his stubborn, barren world. The true breakthrough came one evening. He found her by the fire, struggling with the Bible, her brow furrowed in concentration. He sat down on the floor beside her, the firelight casting their long shadows on the wall. "That's a hard book," he said quietly. She looked at him, then pointed to a word. "What's this one?" She whispered, her voice a tiny, rusty thing. It was the first time she had spoken to him. The word was forgiveness. Silas's throat went tight. He looked from the word to the child, her face earnest and questioning in the firelight, and he began to teach her to read. He pointed out the letters, sounded out the syllables, his rough baritone mingling with her soft, hesitant whispers. They read about floods and famines, about prophets and kings, about loss and redemption. They weren't just reading a book. They were piecing together a language for their shared pain, finding words for the things that had no words. In the flickering light of the fire, surrounded by the ghosts of their pasts, a man who had forgotten how to live and a child who had forgotten how to speak began to build a new world, one word at a time. The fragile peace of their shared solitude could not last. Supplies dwindled, and Silas knew he had to make the trip into redemption. The thought of leaving Alara filled him with a cold dread. He tried to explain that he would be back, that he had to go, but she just stared at him with those wide, haunted eyes. He saw the flicker of a new fear in them, the fear of abandonment, a wound so fresh and deep he was terrified to touch it. He left her with a bowl of stew and a promise to return by nightfall, a promise that felt like a lie in his own mouth. The ride to town was torture. Every mile he put between himself and the cabin felt like a betrayal. He conducted his business in a blur of anxiety, his eyes constantly scanning the road, imagining all the terrible things that could happen. He bought flour, salt, and a small bag of hard candy, an extravagant purchase that made the store owner, Old Man Hemlock, raise a bushy eyebrow. Silas ignored him, paid his due, and rode out of town as if the devil himself were on his heels. He found her exactly where he had left her, huddled on the floor by the door, the stew untouched. The moment she saw him, her face crumpled, and, for the first time since he'd found her, she cried. Not the silent, shuddering grief of the rainstorm, but great, gulping sobs of relief and terror. He knelt and pulled her into his arms, and she clung to him with a desperate strength, her small body shaking against his. "I thought you left me," she choked out, her voice muffled against his shirt, like the others. "Never," he whispered into her hair, his own voice thick with emotion. "I'll never leave you." It was a vow, spoken into the quiet of the cabin, a promise that bound them together more surely than any law or blood tie. He knew then that he could never leave her behind again. The next time he went to town, she rode with him, perched in front of him on Atlas, her small hands clutching the pommel of his saddle. Her presence was a declaration, and redemption was a town that fed on declarations. Their arrival was met with a wave of silence followed by a ripple of whispers. Faces appeared in windows. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Silas felt 100 pairs of eyes on them, dissecting, judging. He kept his face a stony mask, lifted Alara down from the horse, and held her hand as they walked toward the general store. Her hand was tiny and cold in his, and he squeezed it reassuringly. The first to approach was Sheriff Brody, He was a big man who had grown soft in his authority, his belly straining the buttons of his uniform. He moved with a swagger that was meant to intimidate, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Well now, Silas," Brody said, his voice oozing a false geniality. "What have we here? Find a stray on your way into town?" He looked down at Alara, his gaze cold and dismissive. "She's with me," Silas said, his voice flat and hard. "Is she now?" Brody chuckled, a mean wet sound. "Got a name, girl?" Alara shrank behind Silas's leg, her face hidden. "Her name is Alara," Silas answered for her. "And she's my ward." The word hung in the air, a challenge. Brody's eyes narrowed. "Is that a fact? No paperwork I've seen." "A man can't just go around collecting strays, Silas. There are rules. The territory has an orphanage for a reason." The threat was clear. Before Silas could respond, another voice cut in, sharp and brittle as glass. It was Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife and the undisputed queen of the town's social hierarchy. She stood on the steps of the mercantile, her arms crossed, her face a mask of pious disapproval. "A child with no past is a child with no future," she declared to the small crowd that had gathered. "It's an unnatural thing. He's a fool to take on another's burden, especially a man like him." The implication was clear. A broken man like Silas was unfit to care for anyone, let alone a child who was clearly damaged goods. The whispers grew louder. "Heard he just found her in the dirt. Probably a half-breed. What's he want with a little girl, a man all alone like that?" The words were like stones, pelting them from all sides. Silas felt Alara tremble, and a hot, protective rage, an emotion he hadn't felt in years, surged through him. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her closer. But then, a different kind of voice emerged. Martha, the blacksmith's wife, a woman whose face was etched with a permanent sadness since losing her own daughter to the fever 2 winters ago, stepped forward. She ignored the sheriff and Mrs. Gable, her eyes fixed on Alara. She held out a small, lumpy object. "For you, sweet thing," she said, her voice gentle. It was a small doll, crudely stitched from scraps of calico. Alara stared at it, her eyes wide. She looked up at Silas, a silent question. He nodded. Tentatively, she reached out and took the doll, clutching it to her chest as if it were a shield. Martha met Silas's gaze, and in her eyes he saw not judgment, but a deep, shared understanding of loss. "You're doing a good thing, Silas," she said, just loud enough for him to hear. Inside the store, Old Man Hemlock was gruff as always, but as he tallied up Silas's purchases, he pushed an extra sack of flour across the counter. "On account," he grumbled, refusing to meet Silas's eyes. "Winter's coming. Girl needs to put some meat on her bones." The ride home was quiet. Alara held the calico doll in one hand and Silas's saddle in the other. The town was divided. The lines had been drawn. Some saw a scandal, a disruption to the natural order. Others, the ones who knew what it was to lose something precious, saw a fragile, desperate attempt at healing. Silas knew this was only the beginning. The whispers would follow them, and Sheriff Brody was not a man to let a challenge go unanswered. A storm was gathering, a different kind of storm than the one that had brought Alara to him, but one that threatened to be just more destructive. He looked down at the small girl leaning against him, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would not let this storm wash her away. He would stand against it, even if it meant standing alone. The whispers of redemption followed them back to the ranch and festered over the next few weeks. They became a poison in the air, a constant, unseen pressure. Silas felt it every time. He looked at Alara, a gnawing fear that the fragile world they were building could be torn apart by the whims of men like Brody and the judgment of women like Mrs. Gable. The fear made him work harder, his axe swinging with a desperate rhythm as he chopped wood, his hands raw as he repaired the fences that bordered his land. He was fortifying his home, but he knew the real threat wasn't one that a fence could keep out. The threat arrived on a cold, crisp autumn morning in the form of Sheriff Brody and a stranger in a dusty suit. The stranger introduced himself as Mr. Peters, a circuit judge for the territory. His eyes were small and shrewd, and they missed nothing. Brody stood beside him, a smug, triumphant look on his face. "Silas," Brody began, foregoing any pretense of civility, "Judge Peters is here to adjudicate a matter of territorial law. Specifically, the matter of the abandoned child currently in your custody." Silas's blood ran cold. He stepped in front of the cabin door, blocking the entrance. Ilara was inside, humming the small, tuneless song he had taught her. It was the first time he had heard her hum. "She's not a matter," Silas said, his voice low and dangerous. "She's a child. She's my ward." "Without legal sanction, she's a ward of the territory," Judge Peters said, his voice dry as dust. "Sheriff Brody has filed a formal petition expressing concern for the child's welfare. He recommends she be transferred to the state orphanage in the capital, where she can receive proper care and education." The orphanage. It was a death sentence. A place whispered about in hushed, horrified tones, known for its cruelty, its neglect, its rows of unmarked graves. Brody's smile was a slash of victory. This was his checkmate. "You can't," Silas breathed, the words catching in his throat. "I can," the judge replied coolly. "And I will, unless you can provide a compelling reason why I shouldn't. A hearing will be held tomorrow at noon in the town saloon. Be there." Brody and the judge turned and rode away, leaving Silas standing in a cloud of dust and despair. The humming inside the cabin had stopped. He turned and saw Ilara standing in the doorway, the calico doll clutched in her hand, her face a pale mask of fear. She had heard everything. The next day, they rode into town not as a man and his ward, but as a defendant and his only witness. The saloon was packed. It seemed the entire population of Redemption had turned out for the spectacle. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, sweat, and sanctimony. Silas and Ilara sat at a small table at the front, a pair of outcasts on display. Judge Peters sat behind the bar, which served as his bench. Sheriff Brody stood beside him, puffed up with self-importance. He presented his case first, his voice ringing with false concern. He painted Silas as an impoverished, unstable recluse, a man haunted by his own tragedies and unfit to raise a child. He described the ranch as a hovel on the brink of collapse. "Is this a suitable environment for a young, impressionable girl?" He boomed. "A place of grief and failure? The law is clear. The territory has a duty to protect its most vulnerable." Then he called his witness. Mrs. Gable took the stand, her face a study in pious gravity. She described Ilara as a wild thing, silent and strange. "She needs the firm hand of Christian discipline," Mrs. Gable intoned, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "She needs to be with other children, in a structured environment, not isolated with a man who has clearly turned his back on God and society." The crowd murmured in agreement. Silas felt the weight of their judgment pressing down on him, suffocating him. He looked at Ilara. She was staring at her hands, her knuckles white as she twisted the calico doll. "Mr. Silas," the judge said, his voice cutting through the haze of Silas's despair, "do you have anything to say in your defense? This was it." Silas stood up, his legs unsteady. He was not a man of words. His language was the language of the earth, of wood and stone and muscle. The faces in the crowd blurred together. He felt 100 accusations in their stares. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His throat was a desert. He looked at Brody's smug face, at Mrs. Gable's cold righteousness, at the judge's impassive stare. He couldn't fight them with their own weapons. He didn't know the law. He didn't know the scripture they twisted to their own ends. He only knew the truth. I "I'm not a good speaker," he began, his voice rough and cracking. "I don't have much. The sheriff is right about that. My ranch, it's not much. And Mrs. Gable is right. I have known grief. It's a hard companion." He paused, taking a ragged breath. He didn't look at the judge or the crowd. He looked at Ilara. "But I know what I found. I found a little girl in the rain. She was empty. And my house was empty. My life was empty. And we started to fill those empty spaces. I taught her how to feed the chickens. She put wildflowers in a cup on my table." His voice broke. He swallowed hard, fighting for control. "We started reading the Bible together. I'm not a religious man. Not anymore. But the words helped. They gave us a place to put the hurt." He looked up, his gaze sweeping over the silent, watching faces. "Maybe my home isn't what you'd call proper. Maybe I'm not what you'd call a father. But that girl is not a stray. She's not a burden. She's a child who needed a hand, and I had one to give. That's all I know." He sat down, his body trembling, his testimony hanging in the thick air. It felt inadequate, a flimsy shield against the armor of the law. The judge looked at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned his gaze to Ilara. "Child," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "this is a difficult situation. I have to decide what is best for you. Can you tell me, what do you want?" All eyes in the saloon turned to the small girl. The silence was absolute, a heavy, breathless thing. Ilara stood up. She did not look at the judge. She walked, her small feet silent on the dusty floorboards, to the center of the room. She held her worn Bible in her hands. She opened it to a page marked with a faded ribbon, a page her mother had marked long ago. Her hands trembled, but her voice, when she spoke, was small and clear, cutting through the silence like a bell. "He setteth the solitary in families," she read, her voice gaining strength with each word. "He bringeth out those which are bound with chains, but the rebellious dwell in a dry land." She looked up from the book, her gray eyes finding Silas in the crowd. And then she looked directly at Judge Peters. "I'm not solitary anymore," she said, her voice ringing with a conviction that defied her years. She then turned and walked to Silas's table. She put her small hand on his. "I'm home." The word, so simple, so profound, shattered the silence. A sob broke from Martha, the blacksmith's wife. Old Man Hemlock stood up, his face grim. "That's no ward of the territory," he declared, his voice booming in the quiet room. "That's a daughter. Any fool can see that." A murmur of assent rippled through the crowd. Faces that had been hard with judgment softened with shame, then with a dawning respect. They were not just watching a legal proceeding anymore. They were witnessing something far more elemental, the forging of a family. Sheriff Brody's face was a thundercloud of fury and disbelief. Mrs. Gable stared, her mouth agape, her righteous certainty shattered. Judge Peters looked from the child to the man, to the faces in the crowd. He was a man of law, but the law had no words for what had just happened in this room. He picked up the bottle of whiskey that served as his gavel and banged it once on. "The bar. The petition is denied," he announced, his voice carrying a new weight. "The girl stays with Mr. Silas. This matter is closed." A wave of relief washed over Silas, so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He looked at Ilara, who was looking up at him, her eyes shining with tears, but not tears of sadness. They were tears of victory. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, and held on as if he were drowning and she was the shore. The people of redemption, who had come to see a condemnation, had instead borne witness to a resurrection. The ride back to the ranch was different. The air was lighter, the sky wider. They rode not as outcasts, but as a family, legally and publicly declared. Ilara sat before him on Atlas, her back straight. the calico doll in one arm and the other hand resting confidently on his. The silence between them was no longer fragile, but comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. The change was not just within them, it was in redemption. The next Sunday, a wagon rattled up their path. It was the blacksmith and his wife, Martha. They didn't stay long. They brought a milking cow, a gift, they said, for the girl. Martha hugged Alara, a long, fierce embrace, and pressed a small bag of sugar into her hand. Over the next few weeks, others came. They came with quilts and jars of preserves, with sacks of potatoes, and offers of help. Men from the town spent a Saturday helping Silas raise a new, sturdier barn. The women brought seeds and helped Alara plant a small garden near the cabin door. They were not just offering charity, they were offering an apology. They were mending the fence of community that their judgment had broken. They saw Silas not as a recluse, but as a man who had done what none of them had been brave enough to do. They saw Alara not as a stray, but as a symbol of their own capacity for redemption. A year passed. The ranch was transformed. The new barn stood proud against the sky. The garden bloomed with a riot of color. The sound of a cowbell was a gentle punctuation to the days. The cabin itself had changed. There were curtains on the windows, sewn by Martha. A small second room had been added, a room for Alara. The whole place felt different. It felt alive. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon in strokes of orange and purple, Silas and Alara sat on the porch steps. The air was cool and smelled of pine and wood smoke. Alara, now 8 years old, was no longer the gaunt, silent creature he had found in the rain. Her face was fuller, her cheeks held a healthy flush, and her laughter, when it came, was a free and easy sound that was the best music Silas had ever heard. She was reading to him from the Bible, her voice strong and confident. He watched her, his heart full to bursting. The lines of grief that had been carved so deeply into his face had softened. The hollowness in his chest had been filled with a love so fierce and protective, it was almost painful. He was no longer a ghost haunting a tomb. He was a man living in a home. Alara finished the verse and closed the book, laying it gently in her lap. She looked out at the vast, beautiful, and unforgiving land that stretched before them. She was quiet for a long time. Then she looked up at him, her gray eyes clear and serious. "Silas?" she asked. "Are we a family now?" He looked away from her, toward the darkening horizon where the first stars were beginning to appear. He thought of the man he had been, a man entombed in sorrow. He thought of the storm, of a small, shivering girl, of a whispered promise. He thought of the long journey they had taken, a journey not of miles, but of the heart. He turned back to her and pulled her into a one-armed hug, holding her close against the side of his chest. "We were always a family," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears, the truth of the words settling over them like a warm blanket against the coming night. "We just had to walk through the rain to find each other."